Let me tell you a story about a great man. A man who spent 3 years in 4 concentration camps. In 1944, he would be shipped off to the worst of them all, Auschwitz. While facing some of the greatest horrors and crimes humanity has ever encountered, it was also here that the seeds of Viktor Frankl's legacy would take root and one day blossom to become the lesson saving the lives of many. One of the most evil and sinister periods in history sparked the flame and the rise of some of the greatest leaders and freethinkers modern times has ever seen. Without darkness, there cannot be light. In the last 3 years, I've read 100 plus books maybe, and this book is top 10 on my list of best books I've ever read in my entire life. I highly recommend everyone to get a copy of it and to dive into it. Frankl goes into deep depths of what happened in the concentration camp without being overly gruesome. It's very easy to read, it's a fast read, it has very strong points that the world needs to know in today's time. It invokes emotion, it teaches history, and much, much more. I highly recommend it. Let's dive right in. So what's the main message behind this book, Man's Search for Meaning? What can we learn from Viktor Frankl's experiences in the concentration camps? Essentially, the points is we all have a meaning in this life. Nothing is pointless, and we must endure trials and tribulations because there is a future benefiting from us being alive. Our family, our friends, and society in a whole benefits from the works that we do and the love that we produce in the world. We must survive, not because it's our life at stake, but because other people in the world benefit just from the fact that we are alive. So a problem with today's society is that we're a consumer-based society. All we do is consume, we buy stuff to consume, or we do things so we can consume and get a dopamine hit. We always want a dopamine rush. That's why we pull out our phones, we scroll, we get that dopamine and sustenance from consuming content constantly. And a lot of times, even after you get that dopamine hit from that useless interaction, it's a vicious cycle because you want to feel fulfilled, you go seek out a dopamine hit, you get the dopamine rush, and then you still feel empty inside. It's a vicious cycle that goes over and over and over. You're not having the proper sustenance in order to feel fulfilled within yourself. And eventually your life feels meaningless. You don't feel like your days have any point to them, and that's the point of this book. This is to point out that even a man who faced concentration camps still felt that there was a meaning to his life after day and day of being tortured. But people suffer more than they really need to. Let's see what Frankl has to say about those who reminisce about the past more so than others.
A man who let himself decline because he could not see any future goal, found himself occupied with retrospective thoughts.
Oftentimes we think back to the past and romanticize it for being a better time in our lives, even if that isn't necessarily true. Frankl is essentially saying in this passage is that the people who lost sight of the future by only focusing on the past were the ones who were giving up hope the quickest. The people who focused on the past and not the future were more likely to die in the concentration camps than the ones who were focusing on a hopeful future. That is the main message of this portion of the book that Frankl is trying to show the world today, that if you lose sight of the future, just like how many of his fellow comrades and people in the concentration camps did, you will have a harder time surviving because you're so concentrated on the past. I can understand why those people in Auschwitz had that feeling. They probably lost hope because they didn't know when the war was going to end. They didn't know if the Allied forces were going to come and save them from the concentration camp. They didn't even know if the Allied forces knew if the concentration camps existed. So some of them saw no purpose holding on to a future, not knowing if their future was anything but this suffering. Through his first-hand experience of being a concentration camp survivor, Frankl is teaching us here. You can learn from this. Do you feel sluggish throughout your days? Do you struggle getting past the days, weeks, months, thinking about how much better the past used to be? You might be someone who reflects on the past more so than the future. You know the saying where it's, if you are very anxious, you're thinking about the future. If you're very depressed, you're thinking about the past. That's why we have to be centered in the present, and that balances us. And maybe for you, you feel like you're in a never-ending nightmare. Check this out.
I shall never forget how I was roused one night by the groans of a fellow prisoner, who threw himself about in his sleep, obviously having a horrible nightmare. Since I had always been especially sorry for people who suffered from fearful dreams or deliria, I wanted to wake the poor man. Suddenly, I drew back the hand which was ready to shake him, frightened at the thing I was about to do. At that moment I became intensely conscious of the fact that no dream, no matter how horrible, could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us, and to which I was about to recall him.
He would rather let his friend suffer through a nightmare than to wake him up to the reality of their circumstances. When you were in college, when you were in high school, to make the time go by quicker, what would you do? You would sit there, look at the clock maybe, daydream. If you're a guy, you might have been daydreaming about sports, going on a date with that girl, playing video games after school with your friends. You would just daydream, get your mind off the thing. If you're a girl, whatever girls think about. You use those daydreams to escape your reality to make time go by quicker. This guy allowed his friend to stay within a nightmare to make their time go by quicker. That was their equivalent of escapism. How insane is that? Your worst days was and is somebody's dream life. Don't take it for granted. So I painted a few pictures here, but what kept Frankl going? Why wasn't he one of those people who lost hope of the future? Why was he one of those people who didn't reminisce on the past? Why did he keep his mind so focused on getting past these things, having hope? What gave him that? Well, it was a couple things, but mainly the first one was his focus on his works. When he first entered the concentration camps, he had a manifesto or a handwritten copy of his life's work hidden in his jacket. And when he got to Auschwitz through the force of the Nazi regime, they eventually found it, or he lost it and they took it away from him. He lost his entire life's work. At that point, many people would find themselves being extremely discouraged, because imagine for you, for instance, if you go back to college and you were writing an essay that was 10 pages long and it took you a week to write it, and all of a sudden your computer broke, the file corrupted, something happened. You would feel so discouraged, you wouldn't even think about rewriting that paper. That was a lot of work, right? 1 week worth of typing, research, all this stuff, and you can't get it back. This man's life work was hidden in his jacket, and it was taken from him and destroyed. Yet, instead of being discouraged, he saw it as an opportunity to survive through Auschwitz and the horrors of the concentration camp, so that eventually one day when he gets out, he has something to work for towards the future, and he would even become a stronger and better person because of it. So the first thing that kept him going was piecing together all of his life's work that was stripped away from him. Even during his time in Auschwitz, he would find scratch pieces of paper and he would write on them the reworks of his initial thoughts and make them better and more precise. And then eventually when the war was over and he got out, that's when he felt the true urge and purpose to fully rewrite his work even better and go deeper in depths, and now apply more of his life experiences towards his work as well. He doubled down and said, I'm gonna write it even better this time. And secondly, it was the love that he had for the love of his life. He didn't want to survive just selfishly. He knew that if he died, the love of his life would have went through immense amount of suffering. So to save her from that suffering, that if one day she found out that he died in the prisons, she would suffer immensely. To spare her from that, he fought every single day to make it out.
My mind still clung to the image of my wife. A thought crossed my mind. I didn't even know if she was still alive. I knew only one thing, which I have learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in his spiritual being, his inner self. Whether or not he is actually present, whether or not he is still alive at all, ceases somehow to be of importance. In such a position man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. In front of me a man stumbled, and those following him fell on top of him. The guard rushed over and used his whip on them all. Thus my thoughts were interrupted for a few minutes. But soon my soul found its way back from the prisoner's existence to another world, and I resumed talk with my loved one. I asked her questions. And she answered. She questioned me in return. And I answered.
Even though Frankl doesn't explain it yet in detail, you'll find out that because of this and his mindset and wisdom he accumulated during his time in the prison, that he'll later on save a man's life through his experiences and wisdom years after the war was already over.
Once, an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of his severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife who had died 2 years before and whom he had loved above all else. Now, how could I help him? What should I tell him? Well, I refrained from telling him anything but instead confronted him with the question, what would have happened, doctor, if you had died first, and your wife would have had to survive you? Oh, he said, for her this would have been terrible, how she would have suffered. Whereupon I replied, you see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who have spared her this suffering, to be sure, at the price that now you have to survive and mourn her. He said no word but shook my hand and calmly left my office. In some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment.
Look how Frankl's experiences changed a man's perspective on life for the better. Because he survived, he was able to pass this wisdom down onto another man so that his suffering would be lessened. The point is, suffering creates wisdom. Wisdom comes from suffering, and that wisdom that came from his suffering was then passed down to the man who walked into his office and saved his life. There's no way Frankl, while starving, freezing, malnourished, exhausted, scared, tired, could have, in the moments of World War II, foresee why he was suffering. But he knew it was for a reason, and he found that out years later. You may not understand why you're going through the suffering that you are. You may come back and say, there's no point to this. I can't understand why this is happening to me. Why me? There's no point in fighting anymore. I'm going to give up. In another conversation between Frankl and a woman who attempted suicide that was also a mother with a handicapped son, Frankl says the following.
The question was whether an ape which was being used to develop poliomyelitis serum, and for this reason punctured again and again, would ever be able to grasp the meaning of its suffering. Unanimously, the group replied that of course it would not. With its limited intelligence, it could not enter into the world of man. Then I pushed forward with the following question, and what about man? Are you sure that the human world is a terminal point in the evolution of the cosmos? Is it not conceivable that there is still another dimension, a world beyond man's world, a world in which the question of an ultimate meaning of human suffering would find an answer?
This message makes the most sense if you come from a religious background. Just like the ape who is being experimented on, it doesn't understand why it's suffering, right? But there is a point to its suffering, so that eventual serums and cures and vaccines and other things that are tested on it can be then pushed out to the world. Now, let this be known, I still think it's very sad that these animals have to go through such torture, and I don't agree with these practices, but there is a point in this metaphor, that the point is that this ape is not able to understand its suffering. Just like the way you and I may not be able to understand our suffering. But what Frankl is saying is that if you are religious, this makes sense to you, that there is another dimension, realm out there, the spirit realm, heaven, whatever you may call it. You may not understand that there's a point to the suffering on earth, but in the afterlife, there very well may be a reason why you are going through these things, and it may be providing someone, somewhere, with something benefiting them and society, or even benefiting someone in the afterlife. Frankl discusses also that people who are not particularly religious nor believe in God are the ones who are more prone to fall into apathy. And the people who fall into apathy are the ones who are more prone to say that life is full of meaninglessness and that the only reason to be alive is to experience pleasures. I'm not here to tell you to believe in God. If you're someone who's suffering from existentialism, the idea that you are suffering with the idea that you're alive, you ought to consider the existence of God then. Or at least do what Dr. Jordan Peterson says. Live life as if God exists. You don't want to believe in God, you think you're too smart for God, fine, that's on you. At least act like he exists in that case. You'll do a double take on your actions before doing something stupid. Frankl explains that we actually have it all backwards. A lot of people today say that they are depressed and anxious, and that makes them feel like their life has no meaning. But really what it is that because our lives are meaningless, we don't have goals, we don't have ambitions, we don't have a love, then the lack of meaninglessness causes us to feel depressed and anxious.
Existential frustration is in itself neither pathological nor pathogenic. A man's concern, even his despair, over the worthwhileness of life is an existential distress, but by no means a mental disease. It may well be that interpreting the first in terms of the latter motivates a doctor to bury his patient's existential despair under a heap of tranquilizing drugs.
Okay, so let's tie this up in a nice neat bow. The 3 blueprints Frankl leaves for us behind to find meaning in our lives are so. 1, create a work or doing a deed. You may have something in your mind you feel like you want to start or complete. Forget about if it makes you money or not. It's the thing you want to do that's been biting away at your mind and feels like a pit in your stomach that doesn't go away until you make progress on it. Maybe it's writing a book, making a video series, getting promoted at work, being a good brother, sister, son, daughter, mother, father. Something. It's got to be a work that you got to do, that you got to work towards, that you can progressively get better at, and one day produce it, send it off to the world, and it somehow forget about how much value it adds to the world. If it adds value to 100,000 people, 1 million people, if it even impacts one person slightly, then that is work worth pursuing. That's blueprint number 1. Number 2, experiencing something or encountering someone, aka love. The culture we live in today is promoting more and more lust and less love. There must be meaning behind the lust or you are wasting your life. And 3, the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering. We're all going to suffer at one point of our lives, whether we like it or not. So might as well have a smile on your face while you're going through that suffering, because it's going to make it much easier for you to go through that phase in your life, that trial and tribulation, rather than going through it with a bitter attitude. It's just going to make your life harder and everyone's life harder. You're going to go through it regardless, so might as well do it with a smile on your face. What's the point in fighting the reality of your destiny? So if you enjoyed the content from this type of book, here are 4 more books that you could read that are very similar to this in mindset and that hopefully will improve you as a human being. Number 1 is The Alchemist. Number 2 is The Road Less Traveled. Number 3 is The 4 Agreements. Number 4 is The Power of Now. If you enjoyed this content, leave a like, comment down below what your favorite part is, and please consider subscribing. I'm going to leave a PDF link down below for you to take a look at this full entire book. It's all there. You can read it from front to cover online, and we'll see you next time.